Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another installment of Muslim Skeptic Live. Today I have a very special guest with me here to discuss some important topics. Sim of the Mad Mamluks. Welcome, Sim. It's very glad and I'm very happy to have you on the episode.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. I am truly undeserving of the honor. I've really enjoyed seeing you grow in the past few years when some of the listeners and followers of the Mad Mamluks pointed us in your direction and said, hey, this guy's kind of speaking along your lines. And just seeing you grow into not just as a writer, but also as a presenter, just doing some fantastic stuff. Really, really proud of what you've accomplished so far.
Jazakallah khairah. Thank you so much for that. I was actually going to open by, praising your achievements, mashallah, with the Mad Mamluks. I mean, I would say the most popular, or arguably the most successful Muslim podcast in the world. And it's almost 4 years, or is it,
Yeah, it's been
300?
almost close to 4 years now.
Inshallah.
Yeah,
Yeah, because you have a lot of people who want to start a podcast and they don't really follow through, or it doesn't really last very long. I don't think people understand how much effort and time and work it goes into doing a podcast. So, really, mashallah, kudos to you guys for, tawfiq of Allah, being able to last,
yeah.
mashallah, this long.
Every week I get 2 or 3 emails about someone who wants to create a podcast, and after a while, like initially I would respond to each one, and I try to be as helpful as possible, and I always tell them, like, hey, listen, young Muslims aren't very conducive to podcasts. It's not something that you're going to get success overnight. You could be Mehdi Hassan in terms of presentation and your eloquence of speech. You're just not going to get those kind of numbers that you're expecting being a conservative Muslim podcast. Now, if you're somewhere along the other end of the spectrum, you might have a lot more success, and we'll get to that later. But yeah, it's a gruel. You have to keep with it, and you have to keep on furthering or pushing your bar and whatever measurements of success you have. But it can't be numbers. You can
Yeah.
never think that numbers is your measurement of success when it comes to this.
Yeah, exactly. I think that I say the same thing when people ask me for advice on writing and doing social media in general. I tell them, look, if your focus is on numbers and you want to think that you're just going to go viral or anything, that's not the way it works. It's a lot of hard work, and often you don't get that kind of reaction that you might think you deserve. So it really makes you focus on your intentions and your niyyah, because those who are purely looking for numbers, guess what? There might be years where no one is paying attention to you if you're not doing it for the sake of Allah. You're not doing it for the love of the craft. If you like writing, if you like researching, if you like speaking, if you're not trying to hone your craft, then you're going to lose interest when the numbers don't show up.
100%. Find a someone who is more conducive to your personality, someone very successful. There's been a lot of influences in my life, and I'm kind of an amalgamation of various experiences with or interactions of people who I thought were the best at this game. And I always tell people, like, find that benchmark for yourself and start pushing yourself, not to be that person, but go beyond them, and don't copy them, but put your own spin on things and make it your own,
Right.
and that's what I'm really hoping conservative Muslims really, people who are at least creating content and engaging in media, they really push themselves in innovation and creativity, because this is one of the things that they always attack, or not attack, but really look down upon conservative Muslim people who are operating within the parameters of Islam, that, Islam or religious people are restricted in terms of creativity, and that they need, the more religious you get, it restricts your ability to be innovative and creative in your content.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I really appreciate about the Mad Mamluks, and especially, you as the founder and the co-host, you really stick to principles. And even though you're talking about very edgy topics, oftentimes controversial things where you're going to get pushback from these, liberal elements that you're referring to, you are not really bending to that, or you're not compromising on that for the most part. And so I think that spirit is something very unique and beneficial. So, may Allah continue to bless you and give you success, more and more success, bi'idhnillah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and can you just tell us, like, if you have any tips for contending with pressure, people attacking you, attacking the show, criticizing? How do you get past that, and how do you manage that?
So there's as you start doing this stuff, and a lot of people want to say that they want to talk about edgy and controversial things, but they end up going into the banal discourse of what's already out there. It's not really, you're not bringing anything new to the game. You're rehashing the same arguments or discourse that's already taking place. But what I always tell people to do is, you might be wrong, but engage in, don't be constricted to what's acceptable levels of discourse, and yeah, you're going to get pushback. And when you get that pushback, that the way you interpret that, the way you understand it and contextualize it, that is your that's how you should understand where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are. If you take it as an attack and just that, and you don't see that there's maybe some validity in their point, then you're being a dishonest individual. And there's a whole process to this. And in the beginning, it was very difficult to understand why people were upset about certain things. But as you keep engaging with the various people who might not necessarily agree with you, you learn that it's not necessarily that people are always against you. They want the best for you, and they want you to succeed too. So there's people who genuinely hate, and no matter what, they nothing you do will make them happy.
Right.
One of the first things I found out, man, it was a real gut punch to me. A friend of a friend told me, like, hey, you know what? This guy Sim, this was earlier on the podcast, and he said, this guy was saying that you, Sim, you have you surrounded yourself with a sheikh, and you've got yourself a person with a good voice, and things that you're not good at, and wherever he, he's lacking in certain areas to bring on a good presentation, he's surrounded himself with these good things. And at first it kind of hurt, like, man, this guy, he's kind of hating on me.
Yeah.
And after maybe a day or so, and I realized, what, he's right. There are strengths that my co-host Sheikh Amr has. There's strengths that my other co-host Maheen has as well. So what I realized is that I have to keep being in this mode of constantly improving myself, because I would say maybe 2 to 3 years ago when we first did our podcast, I wouldn't be able to engage with you in the way I'm doing right now, because I was an idiot, and for all intents and purposes, I didn't really understand things on a deeper level. I had very surface level knowledge of things, and I thought I had an understanding about things. And so some of the discourse that you see on your website, right, on your Facebook page, 99% of people aren't ever engaging with your content. When they disagree with you, they're really talking about periphery things, or talking about things like tone, and you're not you're not exercising adab, right? But no one actually is engaging with your content. Or maybe there might be one or two people, and there's always exceptions. But what I'm trying to say is that a lot of times when you have when you're kind of unintelligent about certain topics, you directly go to the visceral, right? You have a visceral reaction to whatever is being said. It's not necessarily that you're engaging with the content or the message, but you're kind of going back directly to whatever insecurities you have, whatever problems that are working on a deeper level, in a deeper area of your mind. Those are things that you may have hit on as a content creator, and you may have created some kind of visceral response rather than truly engaging with people. So I've tried earnestly to really immerse myself in books. I've read hundreds of books by now since starting the podcast, just ranging from every subject, just to have that confidence to speak to a guy like you or any other person who, in my mind, is a very bright or intelligent person, and really sharpen myself at the same time. So that's one of the things I'm kind of talking about, is that there's a problem with how we interpret things,
Right.
and it's not necessarily coming from our brain.
Right. I agree with you that there's a lot of visceral reaction. And I think that Mad Mamluks has gotten that as well over the years. But that's the best way to describe it. Like a lot of people don't respond don't respond to the substance when you criticize something that they've really made a part of themselves and they've internalized.
Yeah.
Right. And so just as an example, we're going to be talking inshallah about American Islam, but a big component of the American Islam that has been preached over the years is that there's no real conflict between what is considered politically correct and culturally correct within America and Islam. We're constantly told this over and over and over again, that everything is honky-dory, everything is peachy, we're just trying to be good Americans. Being the best American possible is completely consistent with being the best Muslim possible. And so if you've internalized this over the years, because you're being told this on the minbar by certain popular figures or institutions over and over again, and then when someone comes along, whether on the Mad Mamluks or on my page or anywhere else, and says, no, actually there's some issues here, there are some problems, there's going to be there are conflicts, then they feel like their safety is being threatened. They feel like, oh wow, what's going on here? This is just completely out of left field and it's unacceptable. And so they react in that way, as opposed to just pausing and thinking, well, what does Islam say about this topic, and have I really figured out or done any kind of due diligence to consider whether that part of Islam conflicts with what is being shoved down our throats in American culture. So it's much easier to just give a visceral reaction like, oh, this guy has bad adab, or this guy is immature, or this guy is whatnot.
But Danny, what I was talking about is not just that you're right on the money regarding that, but also it's almost an existential response. Like when a controversial post from Mad Mamluks or from Daniel, when it comes out, it's as if you're invalidating their existence. For example, just recently with the whole Hamza Yusuf thing, like Hamza Yusuf has done an amazing thing, in regards to all the dissemination of knowledge and everything. But when the hell did his sincerity come into play? For a community who hates on Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a person who always talks about intent, American intent. America has this moral high ground that when they go to Africa or in the Middle East, whatever bombing, it's always with good intent, right?
Right.
For people for a community who's always knocking him for using those silly arguments, when the heck do we start talking about intent? And when you're a public figure and you have entered spaces like the Congress, where things like the Iraq War, drone strikes, things like this are being voted on and discussed, the killing of Muslims all over the world are being discussed, and you as a Muslim leader, you enter that space and you deliver a message. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I haven't fully vetted out everything yet, but I'm just saying, when did you become beyond reproach? You've entered that space as a representative of our community,
Right.
And when I see like, oh, how dare they, question these awliya of Allah. First of all, you're no one to determine they're an awliya. Whether they're an awliya to you or not, it's up to you. But you can't make them. You can't give them that title as a community. So there's some there's silly responses coming from people all across the board. Whether you're in liberal spaces or even in conservative Muslim spaces, we need really, what I'm really calling for, Daniel, now is at least if there was a preamble to what the Mad Maluks should be now, is the ayah from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change a condition of a people until they change what is within themselves, right? In Surah Ar-Ra'd.
Right.
And when you and many Islamic movements talk about these verses, but I'm not sure whether all of them, maybe some of them have touched on it to a certain extent, but they haven't really investigated or invested enough time in teaching the masses on how to think properly and how to evaluate reality and how to evaluate certain situations that are coming into play, world events, whether macro or micro,
Right.
So there's a thorough check that we need to do, a rehash of or a reinvestigation on how our mental processes are playing out.
Right. No, I agree. I think that when we're talking about Hamza Yusuf, I wrote about him. I wrote about Omar Suleiman recently. And other figures in the past, like Sohaib Webb, I've written about Linda Sarsour, figures that have a very prominent position, and they are making decisions and taking actions that are highly questionable as to whether they're in the interests of the community as a point of objective fact. Because for example, when you're talking about intentions, right? Intentions, we don't know. We are just judging by what's apparent. And we don't question whether in their minds they think that they're doing what's best for the Muslim community. Okay, I don't doubt that that's the case, or I wouldn't like publicly express that, I doubt that so-and-so thinks that he's working for the best interests of the community. But it doesn't matter what one individual thinks based on whatever. What matters is objectively, what is the fact of the matter about this particular action, like, going and joining a human rights commission in the Trump administration, or, participating in an event with all kinds of progressive, reformist, CVE pushing liberals, and having a conference dedicated to like essentially liberal Islam and cooperation amongst all of these liberal elements, and Zanadiqa, like promoting LGBT and all this garbage. So is that really, like, there's a point of objective fact? Is this acceptable? Is this going to benefit the Muslim community? And a lot of people, a lot of scholars, I would say most scholars, would say no, this is not acceptable, actually. And they'll say it. They might not have a huge social media following. They might not say it on social media, but they do say it if you ask them and you give them all the details. So, what is the role of us as non-scholars? Putting a spotlight on these kinds of issues and these questions.
Well, one of the main things as content creators, and I know when I see your work, I see there's like an inner comedian within you. You have a certain way of your writing style that just makes me laugh, and I never read the comments when you post, because I know there's going to be just silliness in it, and I know like where you're coming from, because anyone who's kind of grew up in America and kind of had some flirtations with atheism, as I did and many others have, and who've kind of gone on to become content creators, we all know, at least many of us know about Skeptic Magazine. And I'm sure you were a reader of Skeptic Magazine when you were young, and it probably influenced you in creating the Muslim Skeptic. And I'm just guessing. I don't know if that's the case. Was that the case, Danny?
No, Skeptic Magazine.
Yeah,
I
Michael
haven't read.
Shermer's Skeptic Magazine.
No, I'm just aware of the concept of skepticism and philosophy.
Yeah.
Like that's what it was based
So
on.
maybe it's just not analogous, but what I'm saying is that the Skeptic Magazine really does a lot of stuff similar to what Muslim Skeptic does, but for atheists and people who kind of want to have a laugh at using hyperbole and various other vehicles that a lot of artists use to, at least people who are writers, to demonstrate points, and with the fact that there's so many, especially even young Muslims, who don't understand what that vehicle is. It's kind of shocking to me that we've kind of come at this juncture, or at this point in history, where some of the most engaging styles of writing are no longer like acceptable. You can't use hyperbole, you can't use satire and things like that really engage with people. And it's not necessarily that what the examples that you're using are true to the letter, but I think you would definitely admit to using hyperbole in many of your examples. But when non-Muslims do it, it's perfectly fine. But when Daniel does it, all of a sudden, no, and it's like you're perfectly happy consuming all this content from non-Muslims that are along that lines of like The Onion. How many people share The Onion articles and stuff like that, and when you do it, it's just, it reeks of hypocrisy to me, because it really bothered me when you were when we were first meeting in the first year of Mad Mamluks. I saw you as the executive director of Yaqeen, and I was doing a podcast for Yaqeen as well at that point. And I was like, I saw you posted something, and then there was some engagements with Linda Sarsour came on, and then all of a sudden I saw, I don't know what made me go to the Yaqeen website, but I saw like your job title changed. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? And this is within a matter of maybe a week or two, or maybe a month. I can't say exactly, but I saw like all of a sudden discourse has penalties associated with it. At least when you're trying to engage with your audience, you're all of a sudden you're not an acceptable medium for discourse. And I kind of saw that as fishy. I don't know if there was any correlation to that, and I kind of wanted your thoughts on that as well. I'm like, well, what the heck happened over there? And this is for the audience. This is completely straight off the cuff. I didn't prep Daniel for any of this. I did ask him, are there any red lines before the show? But
okay, so I mean, not putting me on the spot or anything, but when it comes to my background with Yaqeen, I mean, that's something that happened outside of the public view for the most part. But I mean, certain aspects of it, people did notice and ask, well, why is you have this highly visible role within the organization to start with, and then suddenly you're not there. So what happened? And so it is actually a long story, and I don't want to get into all the details just publicly. But I mean, for the most part,
what I saw was public.
What you saw was public.
I saw engagements with you and Linda Sarsour on Twitter, and then a couple weeks have passed by, and I'm on Yaqeen's page because I'm engaging with their podcast and I'm producing some of their content, which we're no longer doing, but back then we were doing. I just saw, whoa, what happened to Daniel's, posting or his job title or whatever over there. So go ahead.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is Linda Sarsour had posted a tweet. This was in the lead up to the first Women's March in 2017. And Yaqeen started, I was with Yaqeen when they launched at the end of fall of 2016. But basically, some reporter from the New York Times or the Washington Post had asked Sarsour, there are some pro-life groups, Christian groups that want to join the Women's March and protest Trump. What do you think about that? And then Sarsour is quoted in the New York Times as saying, well, we don't want them here. We don't want any part of that. Basically, we're against pro-life stances or like anti-choice is the way that they describe it. So I tweeted back at Sarsour because she shared that her quote on her Twitter, and I responded to that tweet and said, how can you justify this from an Islamic perspective? And it was not overly aggressive. It was just a question, and I just wanted explanation, like how, if you consider yourself a leader of the Muslim community, why are you pushing a kind of liberal view that is not in accord with Islam?
All right.
Of all the things that you can really stake a claim on and say that this is what I'm about, there are plenty of things on the left that Muslims can stand with, and it doesn't really contradict the faith. But you selected something that does, and you've made a big issue about it, and this is going to lead to confusion. I didn't say all that. I just responded to the tweet. Anyway, so this, long story short, was a problem. Like, this was a problem in the organization because, people in Yaqeen are connected very closely with Linda Sarsour. And I was told to delete the tweet, and, so there were consequences basically for my job because of that. What I thought was perfectly fair game. Like, why is it the case if you're a Muslim public figure or speaker or writer or what have you, and there's another person, then why can't you ask questions or even be in conflict or have a difference of opinion and have that kind of engagement and challenge things that are right or not right? That's a part of accountability, right? And this goes back to what you're talking about with Hamza Yusuf and Omar Suleiman and others. Where is the public accountability if you can't ask questions and you have to kind of have this veil of silence where, no, we don't really push back on each other and everyone has to be, on the same team regardless and have the same views, and we never, or not have the same views, but we never openly challenge each other. So there's no accountability there.
Well, what happened to critique? The scholars of the past, they went at it with critique. They would critique each other all the time through all sorts of mediums, whether in person and or via books.
So critique is part of accountability. You have to have pushback, but for that reason, various other reasons, it wasn't really feasible, and it was mutual, I would say, between myself and Yaqeen, that we couldn't really continue in that kind of situation. And so, this was one thing out of many different things. But to just answer your question.
Well, it strikes me, it's reflective of the times that we're in these days, where you can't challenge each other because of this visceral reaction that, you might hurt someone's feelings. Hey, so-and-so, lose some weight. that's no longer allowed because you're going to hurt their feelings. Hey, all these things are there. Intellectual discourse is being cut off by hurt feelings. Is it, in essence, that's what's exactly happening, right?
Right.
That we can't really challenge each other because we're going to hurt each other's feelings, and all of a sudden feelings have entered discourse. And what I always thought was like, ideas are presented to be challenged. That's the way, whether it's in Islam or in the world, the world operates on various ideas being presented and put forth, and people challenge each other, and the best ideas win.
Yeah,
Now,
one example, if I can, sorry to
yeah, go
interrupt you,
ahead.
but of the kind of reaction that is, I think, exactly the wrong reaction. So I did an article on Dalia Mugahed, who has a prominent position at Yaqeen, at various other very visible Muslim organizations. She's the executive director of ISPU, Institute of
Yeah,
Social Policy and Understanding. So I made some critiques of the fact that she has gone on record multiple times endorsing and promoting Muslim Girl,
right.
which puts out very anti-Islamic stuff, pro-LGBT stuff, feminist stuff, etc. And so I just asked questions basically. I wasn't saying like, oh, you're ugly, or oh, you have bad intentions, or oh, you're just such a monster and you're this and that, I'm denouncing you. No, I just asked, look at all of what Muslim Girl is about. Look at all of the endorsements you've made of them. How do you explain that? So it's very benign, but then the way that she reacted, I was shocked because I mean, her first mistake was to respond, but the second mistake was to respond in a very like petulant kind of way and calling me names, saying that I support white supremacy, and which
And,
she
yeah,
retracted later.
yeah.
Actually, like several months later, she retracted that. But well, why is this so offensive? Like the community can't ask you questions. The community can't like say that you're doing this, justify yourself. Why not? Like you should be able to justify yourself. Are you just? I'm afraid that some of these, and I'm not talking about all scholars, because other scholars or other figures I'll communicate with and others will communicate with, and they'll have a productive discussion, or they're willing to be challenged, even challenged very aggressively, and they'll respond. Even yourself, the Mad Mamluks, I think, and
Yeah.
myself, we get challenged all the time. We get critiqued all the time in a very oftentimes rude way. If we
Yeah.
acted like, "Oh my God, go shut up," and you are so stupid, and just dismissive and call with that kind of language or that attitude, that's not really productive. You mentioned it before. If there's a good criticism that we can learn from, great, we'll learn from it and we'll improve. Like we're constantly trying to improve. If it's something that is not correct, okay, then we read it and we responded and we move on. But I feel like certain figures have this kind of attitude of being the chosen ones, and maybe
Yeah.
it's years of not getting any pushback from the Muslim community, because then when someone does say something that is not to their liking, or kind of jives with them the wrong way, then they react in this kind of entitled way, like, who are you to question me? Who are you to like tweet at me and disagree?
Right. But it's eventually I really feel like they're going to move past this visceral response, because they had the same response when they were involved in a lot of the Salafi Sufi debates back in the 90s, when their communities were kind of going to hell, and they weren't really paying attention to some of the things that needed to be really focused on, and engaging with a lot of these theological arguments and creating little camps and things like that. um, they now realize years later the fallacy of that, the silliness of them not engaging uh, with their with the public. And you know you always hear about the jihadist message and stuff, and you always heard them say that the jihadis who went to fight over there, they went all these silly reasons. They gave all these exposés on how the rationale was wrong. But when the when all this was happening, you guys were too scared to talk about it, you know. And some of them actually admit that now. The honest ones. I'm not going to throw anyone off the limb, but in private conversations, they'll admit like, "Hey, I was scared about this. I didn't want to talk about it because I didn't know what kind of attention that it would bring on me. So I just kind of avoided that subject." Um, but then there's also a certain element of people who, you know, disingenuously kind of say that, oh, you know, they're maniacs, they're this and that, they've reinterpreted all this stuff wrong. Yes, all true, but you weren't there helping them understand a lot of those issues. So what I'm saying is that many times you see our scholars have this same visceral reaction to some critique, and they kind of, you know, have this emotional response. You know, sometimes when you ever mess up on the road and someone honks their horn at you really loudly,
Right.
and you know, give them the finger or something, or yell something back at them, but you screwed up. You know, you don't want to admit that, but you know, a minute or so passes, and then you realize, like, yeah, that was kind of stupid what I did. You know, I
Right.
shouldn't have veered into the right lane while, you know, texting or whatever. But you kind of deserve that little honk, you know, and that's what some of the leaders, the Muslim leaders, who've kind of positioned themselves in public discourse, they're going to get these honks, and they have to engage with them. They're going to have like a moment of truth.
Right.
Will eventually happen if they are indeed truthful. Inshallah, they are, and you know, we only hope the best for them. I mean, despite them probably not being very happy with us discussing about them like this, I think years down the line, as they mature in their discourse, they'll come to realize how important these discussions are.
Sure. One commenter makes a good point. Abu Mujaddid in Facebook says one thing that makes the Deen of Islam unique is hisbah, Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi anil Munkar. If that practice disappears, some scholars said there will be no Islam. So, you know, how can we, everyone, Amr bil Ma'ruf, like enjoining good and forbidding evil, applies to everyone equally within the community and even outside the Muslim community. Like, we have this universal duty, and so there's no one who is going to be exempt from that.
You know the example of Umar radiallahu anhu when he was trying to modify the zakat or something, and the woman stood up against him and said, like, how dare you modify something that Allah already, you know, put in place, you know. Right. And that's like a famous story where, you know, someone, they threatened to correct him with their swords, essentially, right? And where has that tradition gone, you know? When it comes to our leaders, they're kind of like an exaggerated representation of society now. They're not necessarily willing to engage. Everything is perceived as an attack, you know. Like, it sucks. Like, I met Omar Suleiman, and I met you know, other various personalities. They're wonderful human beings. You know, no one's saying that you're an agent of capitalism or the imperial project. No one's saying that. We're just saying, like, hey, you're veering off into territories that you don't really understand. You don't understand what how the political sphere operates, and when you enter into a world that's really foreign, there's going to be people who are smart enough to help you move away from certain spaces. And if you're honest and sincere, you would engage with that, and you would say, you know what, maybe I don't agree with Daniel in X, Y, and Z, but I agree with him in this A, B, and C. You know, this is the intellectual honesty I'm looking for. Just get rid of this insincere response to criticism by deflecting it on.
If you look at the Khulafa and even scholars, they would throughout history, they would take criticism in stride, and they would, if something was a legitimate critique, they would modify their behavior. They would modify and say, actually, yeah, you're right, I didn't consider that, or that's a good point. And we see this is in the example of Umar radiallahu anhu, And even the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah would send guidance. Like we don't want to say that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did something wrong, or say something unbecoming of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but Allah would send certain ayat to course shift basically some of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's actions. That's just a part. We're all human beings. We're all Bani Adam, and so there's no one who's excluded from that. And also, sometimes your enemies, right? Sometimes people who are antagonistic to you, they're going to have the best and the most valuable feedback and advice for you, actually. And yeah, it's true. Most of what your enemies will say is unfair, arguably. Yeah. But sometimes the most valuable is going to be found within what your enemies say. So if you're just dismissing people out of hand, friend or foe, that's not useful. I actually am very careful to read the things that my biggest detractors are saying about me, because that's an opportunity to either correct myself or improve my arguments, improve my presentation, improve what I'm doing, so that I'm actually doing better. I'm doing better in terms of dunya. I'm doing better, inshallah, in terms of pleasing Allah. So one thing that I want to ask you about, and it kind of dovetails with what we're talking about. There's a quote here that I have from you from one of the episodes that you did a while back on the Mad Mamluks. And I think it was very telling and insightful, mashallah, and it actually is very relevant to everything that we're talking about and the crisis of American, quote-unquote, American Islam. So in this episode, you said, quote, "We're talking about the left part of our community, of our Muslim community in the West. I think the agenda is that they're trying to drive a wedge between the people and their scholars and break that trust so that the people lose faith in their scholars and other approved imams can take their place." Again, and other approved imams can take their place. People who the left deems credible. So I think that was very, this was from, I think, almost 2 years ago that you said this, mashallah, and I think it was forewarning of the kinds of things that we have increasingly been seeing. So could you just elaborate on that, and if your thoughts have developed since that time, share those with us, please?
Absolutely, and I think this is something you kind of touched on in your recent, one of your recent posts. I think you were talking a little bit about the think tanks in Washington and how they wanted to approach the Muslim community in the West, and particularly in America, and how they want to even help facilitate a lot of the engagements that the Muslim community will do with elements of the left, and they want to make sure that Muslims fully assimilate into this melting pot. Now, a lot of times, people who read that on the surface level, they think, "Oh, that's great. They're going to accept us." But what happens with a lot of acceptance is that there's a lot of compromise. There's a lot of your identity is stripped away from you, right? And there's a what you're seeing now with regards to certain imams and people being invited into certain spaces is what has transpired since 2 years ago when we made those comments. You're seeing people who are engaging with the left being more acceptable in these spaces, and what happens with that is more and more a more diluted version of Islam comes into play. Well, Sim, what's the effect of that? We're still praying, we're still fasting, we're going to do that, and that's all fine with them. The Washington elites, the power structures that the left always talks about, this is all like great with them. You pray, you do your fasting, we'll make sure that you have the Eid parties, and we'll even fund maybe a masjid or two, being built in some kind of poor neighborhood. But what they really fear about Muslims is the ideological aspect, the effect of Muslims bringing Islam as a solution to the modern condition. that Islam can be our entire worldview on things like how the free market engages with people, or how you would juxtapose the Islamic way of human interaction, and how capitalism frames human interaction as, the exploitation of human beings, for example, human emotion, human needs, their wants, every single component of the human being is being exploited to the maximum extent. Right. Your attention, your need for safety, your fears, all these things are being exploited. Whereas Islam has a different perspective, different paradigm on the world, and it examines relationships in a much different manner. This fear mongering that you see now in terms of white supremacy, yes, there is white. There are structure. There has been what's that? The word I'm looking for. There has been
history of racism,
institutional racism. No one's denying that. Okay. Well, what we're talking about is creating this inherent conflict, because capitalism thrives on conflict. When two parties are at conflict, they want to feed each other, they want to sell things to both parties, and make sure that there's perpetual conflict in place. And
let me give you an example of exactly this point that you're making, like a conflict. How does capitalism benefit from conflict between people? So one example that I teach about is with feminism, and we sometimes think that feminism is this benign force, it's just about women's rights, blah blah blah. There can not be a problem with feminism, but feminism is actually a tool of the capitalist, imperialist state authority. And if you think about it, how much of happiness in our lives comes from just having meaningful, happy marriages, right? Stable marriages between husband and wife, and you have children, and you have this extended family. How much joy and love and affection, happiness is coming from that relationship, from that husband and wife. So there's a conflict of interest here with the capitalist state, because if people are gaining so much of their pleasure and joy in life from these relationships, then that's less pleasure that they're buying. That's less pleasure and happiness that they rely on corporations for, that they rely on social media for, that they rely on the state for. Okay, so this is a problem, because people are relying on each other as opposed to relying on the state, on corporations. And so this is a conflict of interest, and this is not something new. Like it's taken on different forms over the course of modernity, but it's been a problem in the colonial context. It's been a problem in the Western context, in the current free market capitalist context. And so feminism, what does feminism do? It says that, look, women, you should distrust your husband. You should distrust your fathers, because they're tools of the patriarchy, and they are oppressing you, and they are controlling you and manipulating you. You might not realize it. You might not recognize that you're being used like a pawn, but that's the reality. It's because you've been brainwashed by society. But the reality that we as feminists and feminist theorists are telling you is that no, you are being used. When your husband wants you and is happy with you taking care of your children, raising your children, being a nurturing mother, that's just a stereotype of femininity that's being imposed on you. No, you have to be empowered. You have to go and work, and you have to go and be pursuing your PhD and your graduate degrees, and so on and so forth. That's what it means to be empowered, and that's what men want to prevent. So this kind of suspicion is created in the minds of women, and it creates distrust, it creates conflict, it creates problems, and families are not as stable as they would be otherwise. So what does this do? What does this serve? And so then tying it back to imams, when you have imams who are supposed to be the standard and
Right.
presenting and teaching Islam as it was revealed and basically conveying the message, when they compromise that message by inputting a feminist bent or inserting these kinds of feminist ideas, then that's they're basically agents, whether they realize it or not. Right? And this goes back to the Rand report that you're talking about, it, of how think tanks, Western think tanks, have been strategizing to create this situation. How do we modernize? Like, this is the code word. Modernize means to make more feminist, to make more secular, to make more liberal. How do we modernize the Muslim community around the world and within the West?
Yeah, and it's exactly, you're seeing not just what you see as feminism. For example, you see some terms like lived experience comes to play a lot. Daniel, you can't talk about what women are feeling because you haven't been through what women have felt. Well, maybe I don't necessarily have to be a woman, but a woman to talk about certain things that I see from afar. You know, when did you have to be something in order to critique it or have to talk about something? Historians, sociologists have been commenting about civilizations and whatever their observations have been through millennia, you know, and now you have this new buzzword called lived experience that's being perpetuated in the community, that you can't talk about so and so's lived experience. You're not Latino, so you can't talk about that. You're not and they're creating these identities, and they're creating conflict within them. Like, I talk to normal Latino folk and black people and everything. We have a great time talking, and what you see in the social media, some of these social media imams who've kind of grabbed onto some of these buzzwords, and you know, it's a lot of, oh man, I'm trying to be clean. They're you know, telling each other that, hey, you know, I'm giving that virtue signal, right? I'm trying to say, like, hey, I'm part of this team. I'm against the institutions of power, and I'm really part of the entire liberal project that will take down various power structures. And this is the craziness that we've in, because their whole, that entire space of liberal project that's trying to take down the power structure, that in itself is a project of capitalism. That's kind of how capitalism kind of contains its people who want to change the system, because eventually people will realize, or are realizing, that it's not you can't really change the system from within, but you have to present an alternate solution that can really make lasting change and will frame things into perspective, put an end to some of the craziness that we see in the world, you know?
Yeah, it's so funny. Like you mentioned that some certain imams, you know, the Snapchat imams will play into this kind of social justice narrative that you have to have certain kinds of lived experiences, and I'm not going to speak on this, or I'm not going to touch on this because I'm not a certain race, or I'm not a certain, like, gender. I mean, you see a lot of this kind of difference when it comes to gender representation. And how many times have we heard, like, a seemingly respectable person, imam, saying, oh, I'm not going to comment on hijab because I'm a man, I have no right to talk about the proper way for a woman to dress. Like, first of all, that makes no sense. Like, no one has said this in Islam's scholarly history. This is nowhere to be found in the Quran and Sunnah. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ, as a man, is told in the Quran, Allah says to tell them, you know, to lower their gaze and to draw their khimar, you know, down over their bosoms and things like that. So it's a man telling women. So that's actually perfectly legitimate and necessary within Islam. But what these imams
go ahead.
sorry, what these imams are not realizing is that they're making themselves irrelevant,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I was just going to, that's what I was interrupting you for. That, imagine what's going on in the mind of a young child who's been told that you can't talk about certain people's lived experiences, but then they're seeing the Prophet ﷺ,
So,
uh, commenting about certain situations, or whether it's related to women, or anything, or any other class intersection of a community. You know, how are they reconciling these two opposing ideas? And this is where a lot of the confusion is happening as Muslims in the West. That you're being told, you're being given a signal by certain imams that, hey, these spaces in the left are okay for you. Where we're part of the activist crowd, where we're hip and we're cool and we're going to be out there marching, and then we're going to do a photo op of getting arrested, and then get out of jail a couple hours later. And then, this is a sham. That is like, people, true liberals would laugh at this. Liberals like Chomsky, who's probably my favorite liberal teacher, and obviously everyone has their faults and everything, but these are just illusions that are being manufactured for the public to see that, hey, there's an activist element that's out there fighting for your rights. They're really not fighting for anything. I'm not saying they're unintentionally misleading you. They're really just part of the cog of capitalism. This is how they kind of contain everything, and they
yeah.
don't want anything to really change and maintain the status quo.
Right. There was one really telling example at the Muslim caucus, which I wrote about, the whole thing that Omar Suleiman was participating in, and it had all of these liberal figures and activists and non-Muslims pretending to be Muslims at that kind of very problematic event. And then you had Abdullah Sayed, if you remember, he was running for governor of Michigan. And so this is something that was reported to me from a friend that attended the conference, said that Abdullah Sayed was asked like about Muslim interests, like how being a Muslim, how are you going to, working for Muslim interests? And then Abdullah Sayed said something very telling. He said, as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as Muslim interests, actually, because whatever we are advocating for as Democrats is going to be for the benefit of Muslims ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So I just, the lack of self-awareness with that kind of statement, like the main demographic that is supporting you, and people were fundraising for him around the country. Masajid were just pouring money into his campaign. He lost the election, but the main demographic. Imagine like, imagine like any Democratic politician saying something like, "Oh, the Hispanic community doesn't have any interests," or the Black community doesn't have any interests, but we have our own, supposedly Muslim politician going on, stage saying the Muslim community doesn't have any interests, and we should just go along.
Some of our listeners actually were big supporters of his, and they were like, you guys, we can make sure that he gets on your show, and we can facilitate this to happen. Just tell us, or express your interest in bringing him on the show. And I'm like, you don't want this guy on our show. If you want to win this election, we're gonna challenge him, because this is not. What is this like? I'm gonna stroke your ego and tell you what a great job you're doing, and you're gonna make change in you're gonna bring a representation in Congress, where you eventually your message gets diluted and has really no effect on anything. How many people want gun control in this country, Daniel? How many people want changes in the way the dissemination of guns are done in this country? But the machine doesn't want it to happen, so it doesn't happen. What people need to understand is, at the precipice, at the pinnacle of capitalism, is self-interest, corporate interests, people who have power. So the way it's kind of layered on top of each other is that, so whoever has the most power and whoever has the most influence in the political machine, they have the most weight in making sure that policies and laws are created in their favor, they're the one who's going to win. And it just saddens me that people have misplaced hope in the political process. I'm talking about the federal level. I'm not. And this is when a lot of people throw ad hominem attacks at you. You want to become a recluse? You want to become a hermit? And you're telling us to live in a cave like the Taliban. Like, you're a silly moron if that's what you're understanding from this. Daniel, people like myself, we've always told you, recommend people to engage with the public. If you want to really participate in the election process, maybe do it on a village or local level, where you can really do some change on that level. But
yeah, change and maintain your values.
Yeah, maintain your values where you don't have to compromise who you are and what you're representing. But I forgot my train of thought. Go ahead.
All right, no problem. One of the things that you said also leading up to today, or one of the topics that you suggested we talk about, the trajectory of Muslim imams and leaders that they've taken in the West, and some of the irresolvable contradictions in their message. So do you have specific things that you want to say on that?
Well, specifically, you remember how we talked a little bit about how you're giving messages about certain lived experiences. You're seeing imams give credence to these areas in the left, and then you see Muslim youth participating in that, and they're internalizing a lot of the values that they're giving. But then you're finding these buzzwords are kind of in conflict with what their Islamic education has taught them, or whatever little they know about Islam, and that the little that they know about Islam ends up getting discarded for the social buzzword. And
what's an example? What's the example of this irresolvable contradiction in their message?
Well, just like we said, talked about regarding lived experiences. We know that it's a contradictory term. It's something. What we need to talk about is this problem within our imams that they want to float with what the social climate is. Like,
would you say all imams, or are you talking about
not
some
all
of them?
imams, but the ones that were prominent? We don't need to mention names for every example, but
of course.
knows who we're talking about. And it's not just imams, but on a more macro level, it's even our leaders in the world. Whether you want to talk about Imran Khan or Erdogan, or name your flavor of the day,
Right.
that they're all operating within this climate where they're not offering Islam as a way to break the established parameters that capitalism has brought. They're only operating within the deep parameters that capitalism has given them, and they're only wanting you to. They're giving you hope to. They're giving you misplaced hope to break down things that can't be broken down. Imran Khan, if he wanted to, you can take Imran Khan's qualities 10 times. There's no way he's going to tell China to buzz off and leave the Uyghurs alone. It's just not going to happen, because that's not the way the relationships between countries are in place. That he will lose power. His country's economy will collapse. Look what they did to Erdogan with regards to his currency in Turkey. When he, for whatever things he's done to upset the West after the coup, they completely handicapped the Turkish currency. So these are preventive measures that they have in place over leaders to toe the line and make sure that they're interested in their own well-being, their own self-preservation, their own people. Don't worry about your Muslim brothers overseas or in the neighboring country. Don't worry about the genocide in Burma, when a country like Bangladesh is like right neighboring Burma. They're helpless.
Yeah.
And why are they helpless? Because it's not in their interest to really help them.
Right. No, I can see these kinds of contradictions. Like you're promoting participation in government at the federal level, you are, as some of these prominent imams. And I think the distinction is important that it's not all imams. It's just a minority. I would argue it's a minority. Majority are not down for this program.
And yeah,
But
I want to emphasize that as well. When we say imams, we're talking about the more prominent people, people who have been elevated into an area of media and public spotlight.
right.
I would say probably, though. When we talk about
certain people
imams,
have been not all of the prominent people are fit in this category, but some of the prominent people are in prominent positions because they've been chosen to be in prominent positions by the powers that be. But
right.
One of the conflicts I think that is telling is that you have imams who are saying, okay, be a part of the federal government. We need to vote. We need to participate. We need to be on the national political scene. But then you're part of a nation that is causing all kinds of harm and damage to human beings around the world, and Muslims in particular, right? With the United States, you have a Democratic Party. Like I remember just recently, you had Trump criticize those 4 congresswomen,
right.
AOC, Rashida, Ilhan, and the 4th one I don't remember. But he criticized them, and then the Democratic response was, "Oh, this is our squad. This is our squad." Right? And then they're promoting that. And then some Muslims fell into that as well. Like, oh, this is our squad. We're so proud of our congresswoman, blah, blah, blah. But then there was recently a vote about BDS, right? BDS. And 2 out of the 4 on the squad opposed BDS. Okay, so this is a contradiction. Like, what are you creating in the minds? You're basically creating cognitive dissonance where Muslims are having to suffer from schizophrenia if we follow this kind of policies that or political program that some of these imams are pushing. Or LGBT is another issue, right? Because LGBT, you have certain figures, like including Yaqeen, including authors and researchers with Yaqeen who are pushing this idea that Muslims need to support LGBT rights because this is a minority, we're a minority, we should all help each other. That's incoherent, and I'm not going to break it down here again. But think of the contradiction, because if we're supporting it here in the West, then what about in the East? What about in Muslim countries where it's illegal? It's illegal to practice this same-sex behavior, and there are criminal punishments for that. So are these organizations and these imams going to support sanctioning those countries, those Muslim countries, support putting all kinds of diplomatic and economic pressure, or maybe even military intervention because of this issue of criminalization of same-sex behavior? So this is a contradiction, and it actually came to light with Brunei and the whole controversy with Brunei and Ilhan Omar basically denouncing Brunei and denouncing the Sharia. But these are the kinds of contradictions that they keep running into. They keep running into these problems, and I think it's going to get worse, actually, because if not, we're entering election season. It's going to be very contentious. It's going to be a lot of extreme views and shouting between these 2 parties, left and right. And it looks to me, maybe you can tell me what you think, that Trump has a very good chance of winning again, a second term.
Right. Like you saw, like the whole Elizabeth Warren thing. You know how she tried to play herself up.
Pocahontas.
Just imagine her being on stage, and he just keeps on calling her Pocahontas. No way. I don't even understand why she's running, but it's obviously, a lot of these politicians, it's more marketing than anything. Sometimes they just enter the presidential races just to get their name out there and establish a brand of sorts. But you're what you're going to see more and more, Daniel, at least as the years go on, is much more conflict in race. That these people aren't solving anything; they're actually creating more divisions because.
Which people? What do you mean? Which people?
I mean the left, when they've made essentially the white race as a antagonist, in their discourse. That
Right.
imagine being a young white child hearing that your everything about your something that is a characteristic about you is evil,
Right.
and you're seeing uh, all these people that look different. That you're in a white neighborhood and you think that what's normal isn't actually evil. How these people are people who talk about healing communities and things like that, but their actions are completely directly contradictory to what they're saying, because they're actually they're making people go farther apart by creating these intersections of various people, and then the conflicts within each intersection that they've identified.
Yeah, I
So
mean, when it comes to white antagonism to whites, um, there was a tweet by some activist in Chicago. Maybe you know what I'm referring to. I don't know if you saw that tweet thread. Basically, she was like, "If you're a white Muslim, you have no right to talk about anything." Basically, do
oh,
you
right,
remember
right,
that?
right. Yeah,
Which is outrageous. Like, this is
yeah.
overt racism. Like,
Yeah.
this is not our way. This is not Islam. Like, we don't. How many
Yeah,
Muslims are
also,
white?
just to contextualize, that tweet was with two Muslims. One was black, one was white, and they were both shouting racist at each other. That you don't know about what it's about. Like, you're being racist about towards white people, and one of them saying the other one saying you're being racist towards black people, and the entire interaction of theirs was lost in just shouting at each other what they find racist, or just calling each other racist without explaining why their emotions were hurt, or whatever factual evidences that were provided were incorrect. Throwing these slogans, these words around just shuts down discourse. It's a level of intellectual dishonesty that I find I lose respect for. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to engage with you afterwards. When I see these kinds of engagements on Twitter or social media, I find you a fake of sorts. You're not someone who really studied the underpinnings of knowledge, and you haven't really interacted and engaged with how some of the greatest thinkers from the beginning of humanity, from Plato and Aristotle and other works that have been preserved from those days, and how knowledge was transmitted, and how their uh, understanding of reality was communicated to the
Right.
world, and how the basic, what's it called, what's the word I'm looking for, when the the first
Tradition.
principles of how we understand a lot of the world that's around us. When
Right.
you haven't really engaged within that territory, you're kind of posing yourself as some kind of a pseudo scholar, because you can tell, like, when you're on Twitter, you see some of the engagements, that either a person who has really went through um, the trenches and went through some of those hard hours, they they've interacted with knowledge in a much more deeper level, and when they're spitting two sentences back at each other, and half of it's just ad hominem attacks, there's really, it shows your level of intellectual discourse, right?
Yeah, that's the whole situation with social justice discourse, right? It's just a matter of oppression Olympics. Who's been oppressed more? Is it
Right.
me or you? We're gonna argue about it, and that's just petty, and it's like a cancer. It's taken over the way that a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, now are discussing and interacting with each other.
Well, what about what we have to bring to the world in terms of how Islam defines justice? How the Prophet brought in a minority, as a minority community in Mecca, how he seek justice from the leadership of the Quraysh, or was he looking to establish justice? There's two different, that difference is very crucial and critical in terms of how we engage with society as a minority. If we're truly wanting to be inheritors of the Prophet ﷺ and be, utilize him as our best example, how did he engage with society as a minority? As someone of the oppressed category. Let's just say, these leftists are onto something, and that they're really talking about oppression. And there's many things that they say is correct as well. On the surface level, a lot of the things, that's why there's the appeal that they have. They appeal to so many people because on the surface level they have a lot of things that make sense.
Right.
But how did our Prophet ﷺ engage with establishing justice? He sought to establish it. He wasn't seeking justice from them, from the authority, the Quraysh leadership. The Quraysh leadership offered him many different compromises, and I believe in the ayah was revealed that said, hey, they seek to compromise with you so that you compromise with them. And what does that mean? And when you contextualize that ayah, you really understand that when they were trying to bring him offers of rulership, you can be our king, you can have as many wives as you want, you can have all the money you want, we can do a trade-off where you worship our gods one year and we worship yours one year. We can have a compromise of that sort, but what you're asking right now is just way too much, and it's going to cause problems.
Right.
And there are many leaders in our community. I'm not saying maybe not leaders, but there are people who would definitely think that's what the Prophet was presented.
Right.
Is a viable solution, or if they were given that same type of offer, they would is a viable.
Right.
But it's something that is doable, and hopefully the Quraysh, they'll see the wisdom of Islam in the future by compromising. And this is something why I value podcasts such as yours, Safina Society, and many others. Hopefully I'm not disrespecting any others, but there's so many platforms out there that are trying to bring a principled version of Islam. It's not just, I hate to use the word conservative because of various connotations, but there's an alternative to modern capitalism that needs to be presented to the world, and I think what we have to offer is really why we've had the success we've had. I mean, yes, many people will say, you guys get a few thousand hits, but look at the superstars of the Ummah, they get millions of hits. But you really look at that, their engagements and their supporters, they're not really being taught anything. They're people who go with the crowd. They're not, when I see our listeners and our followers on our social media, the various engagements I have with them, they're not followers. They're people who want to engage with you. They want to discuss things, and they want to be challenged, and they want to challenge you. And you have we have multiple WhatsApp groups where we have this kind of engagement, and even on Discord, we've set up various places where you can have this kind of engagement with us, and no one's gonna get butthurt and upset about what you said. If you want to come, bring ideas, but don't bring emotions in it.
Right.
You bring emotions as a hostage, then that you're just killing discourse right from the beginning. When you start raising your voice and start shouting, that's when I'm like, all right, well, this guy, he's obviously, he can't handle engagement, and I don't want to have an uncomfortable meeting or discussion with this person.
Right.
I'm just going to do his own devices.
Yeah, it's not like everyone has we don't want to fall into this idea that everyone has a voice and everyone's voice is equally valuable. That's not true, but the thing is that we have a standard. Islam is our standard. So what you say has to be in accordance with our values, because we're interacting as Muslims, and as Muslims that means we submit to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is Islam. So we have to judge by that instead of like who's has had the most oppression in their life or what race they are or things like this. Here's an example of engagement that I just want to read. It's a comment, and I'm reading this because I think maybe you have thoughts on it as well. This is in Facebook. Brother Daniel, under your article about Erdogan and the Women's March, I asked you a question and I'm waiting for you to answer it. I agree that what Erdogan did by, stopping the Women's March in Turkey is the right thing. However, I do not like how he is portrayed as this savior when he himself is jailing thousands of innocent Muslims and calling them terrorists. To me, this is insane, considering his horrendous crimes he has committed towards many, many innocent Muslims. I always appreciate your work, but it seems hypocritical to me that you call out people who are having negative effects on the Muslim community while praising a man who is better at hiding his monstrosity than some leaders in Muslim countries, but very skillfully oppresses many Muslims in his own country. Do you really think it's okay to make him seem like a hero for the Ummah? Or rather, do you see him as a leader who will help unite the Ummah? Shouldn't you be calling him out alongside criticizing others? And so on. So I think that's a fair question.
I've had a lot of that's fair. I mean, there's definitely oppression that is taking place under Erdogan. It cannot be denied. There's no one who can honestly tell you that he's a fair and just ruler in every sense of the word. With regards to some of the engagements he's done in terms of propagating Islam through the media, creating shows like Arturul, or whatever effect he's had in terms of making that show popular. I know that he's very involved in the production or making sure that show is very well financed. That's something that resonates deeply with me and our listeners. So is he an evil overlord? No, he's not. But is he probably an amalgamation of good and bad, like a lot of the, even some of the well-intentioned leaders, there's horrible things about them, and that's really all I can say about him. There's not, I'm not expecting him to be the savior, far from it, nor Imran Khan or any other Muslim leader in the world who, they're operating within their what they fail to tell their people is that they're playing a losing game. The rules are being established by the United States, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, artificial taxes on their industries that prevent them to
grow and expand.
Bring their economies to a next level economy. They're playing in a rigged system, and they realize that when they enter in the power world, the power sphere, and they eventually come to the understanding that, if I can't do this, might as well just look out for my own people or line my own pockets.
I agree. I agree with what you're saying. I think that I don't give unqualified praise to any of these political leaders because I know that that's a bad move. There's always going to be compromises in this world that we're living, unfortunately, at that level. There's going to be major compromises in values. And we see that from Erdogan. We see that from many rulers. Some are worse than others. Like, they're not all the same. But I criticized Erdogan on a number of occasions. I criticized some of the deals that he made with Israel, with Netanyahu. I've criticized him for what he recently said about China and not really putting pressure on China for their treatment of the Uyghur brothers and sisters. So I never give, as a rule of thumb, and I recommend this to others as well, do not give unqualified praise. Praise, if insofar as we want to praise political leaders, we praise them when they do something right, when they do something in accordance with Islam, when they do something brave against the consensus. And that's why I praise, like, for example, the Sultan of Brunei. because of his implementation of the Sharia. I didn't say that, Brunei is the Sultan of Brunei is our hero, and we should, he's the new Khalifa or anything like that. I just said that this is a good action, and we should praise him for doing something right. And then we criticize when he does something wrong. As simple as that.
Recently, 3 people on social media, Yasser Khadi, Dali Mugahid, and Omar Suleiman, issued a tweet saying that they're not going to be part of an event in Turkey where President Erdogan will be speaking. And there was a flyer apparently with their names on it, and they said that they declined that invitation. My first thought was, mashallah, that's great. You shouldn't throw your weight behind autocrats or people who aren't ruling by Islam, right? Because of the various pitfalls that those situations present themselves. Because we're seeing inconsistent logic, though. I'm praising them, but it's kind of a backhanded compliment, actually, when you think about it, because I'm praising them for declining that event, but then also not using consistent logic in their other engagements with the White House and
exactly. So what was the basis? Like, if it's true that they're making a principled stand and saying we're not going to be involved with Erdogan because of he has violated some kind of human rights convention, or
they didn't offer any reasons,
or he is a leader and we generally as religious figures we don't want to mix and muddy the waters by being at his event. If that's the principle on which they're operating on, which would be good, then how can they be standing next to all of these American politicians and endorsing all these American politicians? So it's not consistent at all, exactly as you're pointing out. So these are just the irresolvable contradictions. And also the other contradiction that I was thinking actually was the Diyanet Center of America and just the Diyanet within Turkey, their religious ministry, funds a lot of American Muslim organizations and certain figures too, and invites them, and so there is a lot of money from Erdogan actually in a lot of these organizations. And again, I don't want to name any names. So then, what's going on? You're also publicly saying, "Oh, I'm not going to be participating in this event," which is fine, but you highlighted it as if to make a political statement. So question marks.
We're seeing some of the effects of how, it's got to be undeniable that, there's money that's being funneled from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, to various things that are being, various initiatives. I don't want to throw anything because I don't have facts. So I do know for a fact that money is coming from there to institutions over here. Now, the particular institution I'm talking about, or that's in my mind, I don't have any facts regarding them being receiving that money, but maybe some of the messages that are coming from these institutions, their various engagements within those countries, there could be a link, and I'm not sure if I think that's plausible. I don't think, when you see someone going on a trajectory and then you see another, them taking a U-turn, right? There's a catalyst that happened. Now, you can use the Occam's razor and you can say, what are the most obvious situations that would make someone do a U-turn in their message? And you see, so we saw recently with the whole Hamza Yusuf thing and him participating in that Trump thing, but then you correctly pointed out, how the left completely ignored how Omar Suleiman completely did a similar engagement, and I thought about that as well, and I was like, well, we recently had a debate with on our podcast where 2 people were talking about the pros and cons, and I thought about Omar Suleiman's engagement in that event, and I was thinking, well, first of all, imagine when Omar Suleiman was actually hearing about this whole pushback on on Hamza Yusuf, and I'm thinking, well, he must be like that meme where Homer kind of goes disappears into those bushes. You know, they're soon their attention's going to be coming on me, you know. And, but I was just like, I'm like, well, maybe it's not the an apples to apples comparison because he kind of just went on stage in Congress and he gave.
No, it is not like that at all.
Yeah,
His engagement
yeah.
is more than just like giving a speech at this event, right?
Go ahead.
So, and there's a long history of that, and the point that I was making in the article is that Hamza Yusuf is being slammed over and over and over again. It seems like pretty
Yeah,
regularly, and then you have Omar Sulaiman who is also doing these kinds of things that are contradicting certain principles of Islam, and he's affiliating and supporting and propping up, lending his name value and his brand to groups that are also very problematic, and he gets a free pass.
yeah,
So, and then with the Muslim caucus happening, I just told myself, like, look, enough is enough, right? You can't have him being at this event and it go unremarked upon. And
yeah.
Allahu Alam, like, I'm not saying that I'm doing something unique, but I felt like if I don't say anything, it's probably not going to be noticed, or it's probably not. No one's gonna really raise the red flag on it. So it's contradictions.
Yeah, and it's it's just a representation of our of what our climate has become. Just contradictions after contradiction. People are. Uh, I just see it in my kids. You know, I love studying our kids, man. Not in a creepy way. I'm not a pedophile. Not studying. Studying childhood psychology. You know how Carl Jung. Some of his works. I'm kind of digging into that and trying to really understand how they end up coming up with the conclusions they do so that they make the most informed decisions, right?
Right.
And what I'm encouraging a lot of our listeners is that they, at least the ones that are parents and that have kids, really pay attention to the details in how young their kids are really engaging with whatever morals they're establishing. How are they forming their basis of life? That there's many overarching principles. We know the Kantian golden rule and all that, and there's all kinds of different various interpretations or different forms that comes out in, and you have to really be attentive to you know things they're consuming from um, video games to movies and TV shows. They're slipping in a lot of these golden rules or things that are similar to that are overarching guiding principles that might not necessarily be in line with Islam, and you have to really engage with your kids to really know how or how they're kind of creating their moral framework and making sure that the Islamic framework, that bedrock, you know, we form at least in the very earlier on in the childhood psyche. You establish that bedrock so that building can be built on top of it. That all the things related to the Aqidah and all the various elements of worship and spirituality. You know, you yes, it's important to build the foundation and making sure that you have an intellectual belief and um, you're able to navigate certain uh, areas with regards to how the atheist attacks on Islam or the Christian attacks on. So having a surface level knowledge on apologetics is really, really important, but also understanding that your moral framework, what you see as right or wrong, and then that needs to be really focused on, at least
Yeah.
from parents who care. I mean, look, vast majority of them, we're not living in a bubble. I think me and Daniel fully understand the audience that we engage with. They're people who are seriously wanting to improve the lives of themselves, their kids, the people they love, right? Because the way forward now is that we're in a storm, right? And we're gonna have to huddle up, bring the people that we love the closest towards us, and make sure that we're guided, we're protected against crazy ideas that are happening all around us. There's, I can, I think you'd agree, 95% of Muslims living in the West right now don't engage on the level that we're talking
Right.
about.
Well, that's the example I was telling you about before, like when we started, of American Islam and being fed this idea constantly that there's no contradiction.
Yeah,
Because if you have that idea that, look, being the best Muslim means being the best American possible and vice versa, then you're not going to have any like second thoughts about sending your kids to public schools
yeah,
or the daycare, or you're not going to have any problem like with your kids consuming all kinds of TV shows and just watching TV because you think that, well, it's all good in the neighborhood, it's all good in the hood. Everything is fine, and then you're not going to be, because as you know, you're a dad, I'm a dad. Life is very difficult. We're constantly busy just with our day jobs, and then raising kids, it's difficult to be constantly aware of what they're thinking, who they're interacting with, what they're learning. And so it's much easier to say, okay, I'm just outsourcing it. Let the public school take care of it, or the private school, or the daycare, or whoever else, their friends. But if you're aware of there are some really big problems that are going to negatively impact my child's faith, then you're going to be, at least, I mean, maybe you're not going to have the financial or the situation to send them to a different school or to change, like, or homeschool them or whatever, but at least you're aware of the problem and you can take steps to counteract it instead of just being blissfully ignorant while your kid is losing his faith
right,
or her faith.
right. And whoa, so it's just studying, making sure that our kids, right? I want to make sure that our listeners, people who engage with our content, we're not saying that all hope is lost. We want to make sure that there's there's a way forward for the foreseeable future. We're not seeing the social trends change in our direction right now, but there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason because we haven't taken our faith seriously as a community. We haven't. Maybe people who engage with our content have, but in a general sense, the Ummah hasn't, and that's why we are given the situation we are given. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't change the situation of people until they change what is in with themselves, until they make sure that Islam is a guiding principle of their life. Until they realize their inherent ideas that they've had towards various interactions whether in their business or workplace or in their private life. Until you radically reevaluate those changes, you realize, like, okay, well, this stuff isn't from Islam. Like, for example, just the other day, Daniel, I was talking to a Hindu coworker of mine, very interested in Islam, and he wanted to meet up after work. He's like, hey, Syed, do you drink? I'm like, no, sorry, man, I don't drink, but happy to join you if you don't drink. He's like, oh, I only drink a glass. I'm like, I understand that, man, but I'll happily join you. We can grab a bite to eat, but not when you're drinking. But I know for a fact, Daniel, and you know for a fact that there are people who would rationalize or quote unquote make ijtihad, saying that kind of engagement would have been fine. You can, drink over, or you can have a seat with that person who's drinking. But as we know, as Muslims, we're not even allowed to be in the presence of alcohol, right? So there's people who would rationalize that, say, oh, I made ijtihad, and that's okay. What I'm doing right there is okay because that person is interested in Islam. Like, no, that's not okay. You understand how ijtihad is taking place, and this is why I encourage our listeners and my daughters and kids to have a surface level knowledge of things like usul al-fiqh, right? So that they understand some of these elements. When people fling these terms at you, you're like, oh, ijtihad. Well, he knows better than me. Look, you don't have to be a scholar to understand some of these terms. You can really understand some of the basic levels, and then there's scholarship, and for very good reasons they're scholars, because of the way they've entrenched themselves in that material. But you can have a surface level knowledge that can, so that you don't get intimidated by terms, you know?
Right, but that surface level knowledge comes from this interaction with scholars that you're describing, right?
Right.
Because I'm for myself, like everything I know is because of studying with scholars, reading their work, and they might not be social media superstars, but they're ulama, and it's so important. And I think goes back to the quote from you that I cited before, that taking those imams and trying to drive a wedge between them and the community, and then importing, the leftist, politically correct, approved imams and putting in their place the kinds that will do the ijtihad that you're describing, and basically say, yeah, it's fine, or there are some situations where you can sit and drink, or sit with someone who's drinking, or all of these, you have figures like that, unfortunately, and that's part of why they become popular, is because they are catering to exactly these kinds of cultural sentiments, and making excuses, making ijtihad, making a kind of, even some of them are not even scholars to be at the level of a mujtahid to do ijtihad, but they still do it, and then it's just confusing.
And one thing I want to add, Daniel, is that it's not just that they've positioned themselves into these spaces, but they've also taken away people's agency of power, their ability to organize, the inherent power that you have as an individual grouping together with a collective of individuals. When they talk about these structures of power and how they need to engage with them, and that the only way that they can make any kind of change or lasting change within these institutions is by engagement with these institutions. Well, what you have done in effect is say, our agency, our power is pretty much nil. We have no influence on the world. The only people who can change our situation is you, because so you understand, like, the contradictory nature of that, because they're criticizing power, right? But then they're also giving them the agency of the distribution, or the distributors of justice and power, or the people who can actually disseminate any form of justice, right? So there's that another contradictory type behavior that I've noticed as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think that one of the things that came to prominence recently in social media was this idea that imams cannot address anything having to do with psychology. Imams cannot address anything that has to do with like family counseling. That has to all be outsourced to professionals. And if an imam thinks that he can like talk to these issues, and he's wrong, and he's doing injustice, I thought that just doesn't make sense, because along the lines of what you're saying, like outsourcing power, outsourcing like the authority away from imams, away from scholars. Like, I agree, and I think it's true that there are certain issues that an imam is just not capable, based on his or a scholar of Islam is not capable of addressing. Like, if someone who's schizophrenic or has some major mental problems comes to the imam and says, like, what's the deal? I mean, unless the person is possessed by jinn, which is possible. Okay, and then in which case the imam, maybe he's a raqi, or he knows a raqi who can help. But if it's like a actual medical condition, then sure, that can be outsourced. But many of the issues like that people face, and the problems that they face with their spirituality, might manifest as a psychological issue, or like as a mental health issue. But like, who made this kind of distinction between mental health and spiritual health? And the psychologist is not going to be able to address the spiritual issue, which is for certain issues at the heart or at the core of the mental issue that the person has. And so to say that, imams are irrelevant, let's trust the professionals, let's trust these psychologists, even if the psychologist is a Muslim himself, but he's not going to have the training and the knowledge and the expertise that the imam or the scholar has on these kinds of matters of the heart, matters of the mind and the spirit. So this kind of trend of belittling the scholars and saying they're not relevant to psychological issues, to family counseling issues, this and this, I think that speaks to what you're saying now, and the quote that I had quoted you earlier of driving a wedge between the community,
right,
and these imams.
Right, and you notice this, Daniel. Recently, we acquired the Madam Musa acquired my wife's organization, SEMA, and we've started implementing mental health podcasts into our regular format. So what we realized is that the psychology community has been infiltrated by a lot of the leftist discourse, and we found some amazing people like the Khalil Center over here in Chicago, and there's other places that are really trying to integrate Islamic psychotherapy in their curriculum, in their treatment programs, so that it's not so that when patients that are Muslims that don't have this struggle with their psychologists, so that when you have a lot of engagement with psychologists, there's always this barrier that you're fighting, because the psychologist doesn't really understand your moral framework. They don't understand what you are always pivoting from. We always have this anchor of Islam as our backdrop, and or where we sprout all of our actions from. And when our behavior isn't in line with that, it causes psychological dilemmas. And right. Secular psychologists can't understand that. So right. We've kind of discovered this problematic behavior within secular Muslims who are psychologists, who aren't necessarily utilizing Islam in their psychotherapy. You're seeing people who are identifying themselves as Muslim psychotherapists, but are very in line with the LGBTQ agenda and how the various talking points that movement has brought in. Like, for example, how sexual fluidity is only in one direction, that you can only become homosexual, but you can't become heterosexual.
Right.
So how they kind of control that narrative that sexual fluidity can only travel towards homosexuality. You can't come back around. Once you become homosexual, you can't get therapy to become a heterosexual. Right. So they've kind of controlled those. They've controlled the narrative on many psychological issues that are happening. And I don't want to digress, but
right. I think there's a lot of these kinds of issues where you have what's considered the religious sphere, and then you have the professional secular, whether it's psychology, whether it's activism, whether it's politics, whether it's raising children, right? To what extent does the religion speak to that, and to what extent does Islam speak to that, and to what extent do the secular sciences speak to that? And then so it's a question of a conflict, right, between religious authority and secular authority. And then you have this clear motivation and effort to put the secular sciences and the secular authority above the religious authority, right? In all of politics, like you said, all of these different areas. And so, but who decides what sphere is what, right? I feel like a lot of the conversation is being dominated by people who have their interests or have their source of funding or background within the secular sciences. And they're the ones who dictate and draw the lines and say, well, this is where the imams, you can play in here, okay? But don't try to come out of that. They're the ones who are saying the boundaries. And I don't think that's legitimate, because the ulama, the scholars will recognize and have recognized historically that they have their limitations on what they can address. But they are best placed to, draw those lines, and then they consult with people as needed. That's why I asked you earlier about, like, as non-scholars, like what is our role to play. I think that a big part of it is, making sure that people recognize this hierarchy. Like, we have to respect knowledge because we respect our religion, and we care about guidance, and we know that that's really going to be, the safina, the ship that is going to save us. That's the source of salvation. And right. So we have to stick to that, as opposed to breaking off or encouraging our readers or our listeners and our audience to go away from that.
Yeah, and that's why, when we first started our podcast, Daniel, we really did not want conflict. We came from, a lot of in the 90s, there were a lot of conflicts with the various types of interpretations of the faith, and we really wanted everyone to get along. And as we had a lot of contacts as well, and we were able to bring on prominent names, and mashallah, they're all very good human beings in terms of nice approach, etiquette, and all that, mashallah, amazing people in that respect. But right. when it came down to the bare bones ideas, you realize, like, what a superficial level of engagement that they're actually having. They're not really interested in changing the underpinnings of thought. They're not really interested in making their followers not become followers, but become leaders. They're really just going to become leeches that will always be dependent. And this is another corollary of capitalism, is that capitalism wants you to be stupid. They want you to keep you in a perpetual state of ignorance so that they can continually capitalize off your ignorance on whether it's, consumer products, knowledge, anything. It's always interested in making sure that the human being is a drone. It wants you to. If it was possible, it can make you break rocks into little rocks for the rest of your life. If I can borrow a phrase from a Tarantino movie, they have no regard for your humanity, and they want to figure out how we can keep utilizing you. So this is what they do. What I've discovered, at least from the original guests that we've got, from many of the well-known personalities. I'm not saying all of them, I'm just saying a few of them. There wasn't really that level of discourse where you're really getting anything innovative. It was all like punchlines and pre-planned, scripted conversations, things they were already ready for, and I really feel like if I could go back in time, I would not do them again, because I feel like it's not very representative of who we're about.
Right.
We're about not making you a follower of our podcast. We want you to become a leader in your family, in your masjid, in your engagements with society. We're not interested in you in having the 1 million plus down podcast or whatever. Right. I would be interested in some level of benchmark in terms of how we're, I'm kind of contradicting myself in terms of relating to numbers. There is, numbers are important. You don't want to have a following of 5 or 10, right? You want to have some sort of following so that you can kind of measure yourself in terms of how you're engaging with your audience. And one of the more important things of what you were mentioning regarding, our role as the kind of intermediary for people who are scholars, is that our engagement with our audience is in regular language, and you being, from the prestigious university you went to, you could totally have an arsenal of vocabulary at your disposal, but you utilize words that make sense to people, and you've made yourself a conduit to the scholarly world, right? You're able to interpret some of the things that they say, and really make it more something that is more tangible for the average Joe. And that's what we're trying to do as well, in a more entertaining, comedic fashion. I love comedy, and I one of my favorite things to do is just crack jokes during the podcast and make the whole experience more enjoyable.
Sure. Hey, well, alhamdulillah, we about 2 hours, and I've kept you a long time. Time really flew. But before we finish, can you just share with us big plans coming up for Mad Mamluks, or anything that you have in store for everyone?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, we just redesigned our studio, and we're kind of going through some of the transitionary period regarding that. So you expect a lot more higher quality production. We've had some issues related to some of the equipment we had dropping, not being able to handle the requirements that we put on it. So we got newer computers and things like that, and we're also branching out with a mental health initiative called SEMA, so that we engage on a more personal level with related to your own psychology and your own mental health, but also loved ones that might be affected by psychology or psychological illnesses, and how to be more supportive of people who are struggling with that. So there's always many various things that are happening at the Mad Mamluks. Just keep in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at the Mad Mamluks, and you'll always find out information there.
Okay, inshallah. Yeah, I'll link all of the information about Mad Mamluks in the description, inshallah, of the video on Facebook and YouTube. Again, I appreciate you coming on, Sim, and speaking with me, making me laugh a few times. And so may Allah continue to use you for khair, and help the community through you, mashallah, and your leadership. And so I wish you all the best in your work. And I've always appreciated the way that Mad Mamluks approaches different topics, and you've invited me on the podcast a few times, and it's been always an enjoyable experience, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. And you've been, I'd never say false praise on someone, and genuinely mean it. You've been kind of a benchmark for me to be more principled in many of the things I should be more principled on. A lot of cues I've taken from you in the way you engage with your listeners, and you've always been so helpful in that regard, and I really want to thank you for that.
Alhamdulillah, thank you so much. Okay, everyone, well, thank you to all our listeners, the audience. Again, for more information on the Mad Mamluks, check the description of this video. We'll have links, inshallah. And if you want to follow more of my work, MuslimSkeptic.com on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also check out alasna.org for my institute for learning more about Islam and modernity, and how to fight doubts in Islam. So jazakumullahu khairan, everyone, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.